Okay.
Okay, so welcome everybody to our today's Brainfood Talk. My name is Paul Rohotzka. I am a software gardener here at Square Solutions in Vienna, and I'm very happy to have the opportunity to introduce you today to my colleague Julian Tandler, and Julian will be talking about No Estimates, a deep dive into business agility. Welcome, Julian. In case you might wonder what is a Brainfood Talk, we at Square Solution totally believe in that sharing is caring. So if we want to grow, if we want to get better, and if we want to stay relevant, we are very keen on learning, on sharing what we know, what we are excited about. And for that, we have an internal format that is called the Brain Food Sessions. And now, with the beginning of this year, we already started to open up this format to a broader audience for the software development community via YouTube. And that is what our Brain Food Talks are about. So we are live on YouTube. So if you are watching really the stream, then we want to totally invite you to use the chat, the YouTube chat for this stream to ask questions. So anytime during the talk, when you want to know something, when you have some comments on the material presented, feel free to jump in and write your comments because after the talk, Julian will be happy to answer your questions. So without further ado, I can hand over to Julian and see you later at the Q&A.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul, for this quick introduction. And yeah, as Paul already mentioned, I will talk about no estimates today. It's going to be a deep dive into agility, and many of you are already wondering what these topics actually have to do with each other. But yeah, you will find out during the talk. I will guide you through the topic. So quick introduction. Who am I? What am I doing? So as Paul already said, my name is Julian Tandler, and I wear many hats here at Square as a team lead, as a project manager, but I'm also in agile coaching. And yeah, this is definitely what I am doing today, giving you some insights on business agility through the topic of no estimates. The agenda for today is, yeah, really straightforward. We start with an intro, currently doing that. We will take a deep dive into the no estimates topic. I will give you some examples. That's what I promised you. And we will finish with a recap and a Q&A, like Paul already said. Okay, so for an introduction, I mean, this is quite of a niche topic, this no estimates. And yeah, how did I get here? How did I come up with the idea of this talk? And about a month ago, I had the pleasure to welcome a new colleague to our team. His name is David. And David, what I really value about him is that he's a very curious and challenging kind of guy. And during one of our refinement sessions, he quickly noted that we're actually not estimating our stories. And he was like, "Why are you not estimating your stories?" And I was like, "Well, David, how much time you've got? This is going to be a long explanation." And so we actually set up a meeting. I think it was the day after already. And we really had some very good, challenging and fruitful discussions. And I think it was after around an hour or so that we came to an agreement that it doesn't really make sense to estimate in our environment. And so we came up with the idea to just share this discussion with you, to actually make a Brainfood Talk out of this and tell you when and where estimations are useful, when you maybe can get rid of them. And this brings me to today's goal already. So today's goal is for sure not to abolish all estimations and yeah, estimations are inherently bad or something like this. No, the goal for today is to tell you our story and to tell you the story of the no estimates movement, to tell you about the fields of application and the usefulness of estimations in different contexts. So quick background, what is actually this hashtag no estimates? Yeah, it originated, exactly 10 years ago. It was 2012 that someone posted this no estimates hashtag. I think this guy was called Woody Sewell, and he came up with this provocative statement that all estimates are waste and they're not adding any value, as in the lean kind of sense. So I think you all know the 7 wastes of software development, lean theory. And he said they're not adding any value. So of course, this was very provocative. And we want to revisit this whole movement and what happened in the last 10 years, and not just from the no estimates movement, but there's also a counter movement. Surprise, surprise, it's called #estimate. So how are we going to approach this topic now? First of all, I want to go over what estimations actually are. So what are we talking about when we say estimation, estimates, and so on? And what we want to do is we want to utilize complexity on the way. So complexity is going to be one vehicle that guides us throughout the whole talk. And this is what I want to start with now. So what is complexity? So the Cambridge Dictionary says complexity is some kind of guess. It's a part of having many parts. It's being difficult to understand. Yeah, something where you can't easily find an answer to. So this can be a problem of great complexity. This is one example here. So as I said, complexity is going to be a key part here. We will use it for categorization later. So remember this one. I will explain it a bit in more detail later. And of course, what is an estimation? An estimation, that's what the Cambridge Dictionary says, is a guess or calculation about cost, size, value, etc. of something. Can be a computer-aided estimation, estimations of the costs. These are just really examples here. So what I want to add here is complexity in person hours. That's usually measurements that we use for estimations in software development. And I want to introduce you to some other kind of how I would measure estimations. So I like to use the word magnitude for an estimation. Either an estimation has a high magnitude, a low magnitude, and there's surely no clear boundary in between them. There's some liminal domain in between high and low here. But what do I actually mean? Magnitude just doesn't have the connotation of size here or something, but also on the impact. You use that for earthquakes as well. So actually, if you mess up an estimation for a whole project, for the cost, for the timeline of a whole project, this has much more impact than messing up some story point estimation, for example. And this is already the quite valuable and the quite important distinction here that I will be using, that low and high magnitude of estimations. Okay, so after this quick introduction to complexity and estimation, there are still a lot of open questions. So how are we going to approach this topic now? Because when I read about complexity, when I read about an estimation, I was still asking myself, so, but who's actually estimating? Who are we talking about? A developer? Who are we estimating for? For the CTO, for a PO? And as I said, what's the importance here? Is it a small customer project? Is it the next big thing in tech? What are we actually estimating? A story requirements document? Are we estimating it in person hours, in story points? Is it some really, really big project for many, many years with a lot of FTEs here? And to really structure this, I told you that I will utilize complexity as our vehicle here. I will just utilize a framework because that's just what consultants do. Consultants love frameworks. So there's a framework here that is actually used for complexity for many, many years. I bet many of you have already seen it. It's called the Knafin framework, in case you wondered how to pronounce that. And what is the Knafin framework? I don't really want to go into every detail because this would be a whole talk in itself. But the Knafin framework in a nutshell is a sense-making framework for complexity. And it's no 2 times 2 matrix. Actually, it looks like one, but it is no 2 times 2 matrix. This has many, many dynamics, many domains in there that have to be explained. But for the sake of simplicity and because it's really enough for us, we will use these 4 obvious domains: so clear, chaotic, complex, and complicated. And we will apply them today. And of course, you still might be really, really confused on how we're going to approach this now, but I will go over each and every one with a lot of examples here. So you will get the gist. Let's start right in with the first one, which is chaos. Yeah, this is the first domain I want to talk about. And as I said, we will look at estimations and estimations in chaos. So what is chaos? Chaos is some new situation. It's something you've never seen before, never done before, and you have almost no approach or no approach at all in dealing with it. So what do you have to do? You have to trust your gut feeling. You have to act. You have to check your results, and you have to respond accordingly to make it controllable. So let me give you an example. Think of the pandemic. Think of lockdowns. It was completely novel to you and politicians. Maybe none of us has ever experienced anything like it. You didn't have any idea on how to approach it, or maybe just limited ideas, yeah, from far references. So what happened? Politicians just acted quickly. They tried things. They did a lockdown. They checked the response, and somehow with these small iterative steps, 2 years on, 2.5 years on, we kind of got it under control already. And I think there are many, many things that you can think of in the IT context where you have same things, where there are completely novel technologies and you really have to experiment with it to find out and how to move to another domain, so really get this under control. So, but when talking about estimates in a chaotic situation, so what are we actually estimating? We don't know what the requirements are. We don't know anything about the technology here. Yeah? So estimates and chaos, so the maximum complexity, they don't really go together. Why should we estimate anything here? So of course, this is still not a very tangible example for you now. And I promise you, I will give you something way more tangible now in the next domain, which is clear. Yeah, that's the complete opposite of the chaos domain. Yeah, so a clear domain is where you have direct cause and effect relationships. There are little information. There's just a few variables. There are best practices. You just have to sense what you're dealing with, categorize it, and actually respond. Let me give you a tech example. So if you're building the same website with the same WordPress template over and over again, it's super easy to estimate your efforts, to estimate your costs, to give your customer a timeline, bill it right away, because you know you just have to exchange some content, some pictures. But if you're estimating things like this, and this is now where we're getting to the core of what I want to tell you. First example of the core. So if you're estimating this high magnitude estimation, yeah, where you're estimating costs and time, usually in software development, some teams still tend to estimate every story still. Yeah. So you and a colleague, you're implementing this project, and yeah, you still estimate everything, every story here. And the thing is, yeah, but why would you estimate anything on a micro level if you can just pull out your plan? If your micro estimation is doable, but it's not even necessary anymore. It just costs you time, it just costs you money, but there's no additional value. And this is already one of the core arguments of the no estimates movement, that they say, hey, why should you do something, that estimation on the micro level, that does not add any value to your process? And next on, I will go over with some more real-world examples that you're usually confronted with, and dig deeper into alternatives of estimations. The next thing here is that complicated, complex thing that I mentioned before. Somewhere between heaven and hell, somewhere between everything is super cool, I understand everything, and on the other hand, being in complete chaos. And I would argue that complicated and complex are kind of the same thing. Actually, they're not, but in software development, you always go back and forth between these two domains. Yeah. So let me give you an example. You start with a story. It's some simple CRUD operation. Yeah. You just this new front end, some CRUD operation. You're super experienced in that. You know the technology you're using. You can mostly come up with a pretty accurate analysis of the problem. You can come up with a plan for the implementation that is quite accurate. Yeah. So this is the complicated case. But in software development, as I said before, we're moving back and forth because next day you're confronted with a new problem. It's a complex UI. You get new business logics, you get complex business logics, and you want to do that in a new front-end technology that you're not experienced in. And I'm sure that you will find yourself experimenting with this new technology, gathering knowledge and trying to make it somehow controllable. So moving it from a complex domain to a complicated domain, to really emerge a new practice on how to do things. And next time you're in that same problem, it's going to be easier for you. So that's what I mean with going back and forth. So from now on, I will just use complex for the sake of simplicity. Okay, but now let's really get to the core here before I really bore you out with this. Let's start with a quote here. Alan Hollop, that's one of the guys in that no estimates movement. He said, building software is nothing like building houses. In software, you don't know what you're building or how you'll build it when you start the project. You might think you do, but you're usually wrong. So, and is that true for that domain that we're usually in? I would say yes. And if I would ask every single one of you, I would get a lot of yes here. Because that's just the reality of doing projects, of developing software. But what does this actually mean now for estimations? Where do they come into play now? And now we'll go over the really organizational structures and the business agility that I promised you to go over. So let's take an example here. Yeah, we got Cookie Bank. Cookie Bank is a small bank. Yeah, and this small bank, it has a super high value project. Yeah, this project is so super important that the bank, because it's very small, is not really sure if it can survive without it, if they don't have this. So what does project management say? Project management says, hey, development estimate. Yeah, I want to know how much it costs and how long it will take. So if you're done, please develop it like you always do in sprints or whatever. So the question here that no estimates is posing, is an estimation really useful here? Because what it does to come up with this plan with how much money it's going to cost, it's a lot of time, it's a lot of effort to do so. And the question here is, are you doing it because it makes sense? Or are you just doing it because your stakeholders want you to? Yeah, you might say, okay, but it helps us think about the problem. So when we're estimating, we're talking about it. Afterwards, we know what we're doing. But remember the quote of the house that you have a constant discovery and the scope is for sure not fixed. If you follow this assumption, then there's not much information to base an estimate on. I know this sounds really provocative, but again, given this constant discovery, why do you want to push someone to get done on time if you don't really know if this is going to be on time because of that constant discovery? And this whole thing, this whole process around usually just really burns people out. It creates dysfunction. It also needs an enormous and expensive infrastructure for making sure you're staying on schedule. And of course, this infrastructure, again, needs money. And this money, these resources could be spent doing the actual work, creating value in the lean kind of sense. And what I think they get a point here. You should definitely consider that when estimating. But before you're now rage quitting because you always done this and you don't really get why and you need estimates, I want to pose an alternative here. Yeah. So what could be the alternative here? The alternative that no estimates is proposing instead of not doing any work is doing some work. Yeah. And what are they suggesting? They say, hey, just look at the really high value parts. So the things that are really important for business, that are really important for your customer. And take out this high value thing and prototype it. So get at the core, take it, prototype it, develop it. And this will be quite similar like an estimation. If you time box it, let's say a couple of days, a couple of weeks, maybe a month. Just think of what you're doing with spikes. You're doing kind of same things. You're trying things out. And so what this gives you in the end, after this small time box that you're putting it in, it gives you really insights to your strategic value of your project because you know it has a very, very high strategic value. So what can you do? You can do better decisions here. That's what I think. Because what you get is really a valuable, tangible thing. You reduce unforeseen complexity. You plan and base on reality. You can project your resources, your costs way better than just doing everything in theory. You can answer questions like, can I roughly build it in a year? How many people do I need approximately? And that's really the core here, because worst thing, you're just killing a project that's a couple of days or weeks old if you find out, okay, that's not doable at all, and we have to think of an alternative. What I think is that this is like a truly agile approach here, because it emphasizes experimentation and that inspection and adaptation thinking. And it's actually, as I said, reducing some complexity, and it creates value, makes things controllable. And I think this can be a good alternative to estimations in some cases. Okay, so next thing is the project is running now. We're still at Cookie Bank. And we're estimating these stories now in refinements. Yeah, so we broke down everything that we need and we're in the refinement. So now I'm talking about low magnitude estimations in a complex environment. And the development is a bit constrained by business analysis here. Business analysis really knows what the customer needs, or they think they do know what the customer needs. And they rate stories like, as a system, I want to consume data X, Y, please estimate the complexity here. And they're refining the story 10 times. It goes to the sign-off process. And then this whole scroll of truth is being passed down to this agile development here, how they usually call it. And of course, yeah, that's not agile at all. Yeah, that's some water scrum, maybe with a fall in the end. And that's definitely not in my definition of agile, to move quickly and respond to user changes and needs. So, of course, first of all, what could you do in such a case? Yeah, definitely let requirements emerge. Yeah. See the scope as a constant of change. So it always changes. You just have to accept. Experiment, rapid user feedback, a lot of conversation through all layers of value creation, rather than having that fixed constant that just needs to develop. But now let's get to estimations in this kind of thing here. You usually can do 15 story points per sprint. Yeah, that's what we need for planning. We know we can do 15 story points, so we have to estimate every story because that's what we need for planning. And there's nothing wrong with that in general if these story points in the end are a result of conversation, of understanding, of deep understanding, because then they're just good in the process. Yeah, because you're actually understanding, you're challenging, you're creating value here. But on the other hand, sometimes it's just a pointing exercise, yeah, because the business analyst knows the user needs, and this whole process is constrained in value creation. It even hinders value creation if it's just a pointing exercise. If the goal of this whole refinement is just to have points in the end and not to actually understand what you're doing. And what can you do in such cases to really get to a value creation again? Instead of having average story points, try average stories. And what do I mean by this? Usually you know that you can look into your last couple of iterations, how many stories you're usually developing during a sprint, and just take this average for planning ahead. And it doesn't really need to be completed. Everything needs completed, because there was never anything like a sprint goal in Scrum. It was always like that you want to create value, and this is the goal here. Yeah. So just average stories, no matter if you're completing every one of them, is okay, because you want to create value and you want to inspect and adapt this value after one iteration. And that was Scrum was designed for. So really try these things, because it's easier to do and it's just a natural process in doing it. And the goal in Scrum is still value creation, and not fulfilling a sprint goal with some arbitrary number of story points. Okay, next example. And we're already getting quite to the end here with our examples, but I promised you some real world example, and we're getting there now. This is a example that maybe many of you face. Yeah, you get a project opportunity at the Cookie Bank. So we as Square, external consultancy, external software development, we're getting an opportunity to develop a cool project for the Cookie Bank. But the Cookie Bank project management says, hey, of course, we need a detailed plan here. What does it cost? How much time do you need? Cookie Bank does that because they want to reduce their risk, yeah. And that is okay, because they want to have planning safety. That's a legitimate interest. And it actually adds value for them. But what it doesn't is that it adds value for the end customer, because someone has to pay for this effort. So what are you going to do in a thing like this when they say, hey, please come up with these estimation? There's limited options, to be honest. Maybe you have already cooperated with the Cookie Bank. Then you could use some POC approach. But if they don't say, hey, we can do that, or we don't really trust you, then there's nothing really you can do around that for coming up with an estimation. But still, as I said, that doesn't make the estimation right, because it still doesn't create end user value. So Cookie Bank now really got big. We agreed on doing this whole project with Cookie Bank. Yeah. And Cookie Bank now has many vendors. And these vendors somehow have dependencies on your project. And you see where we're going, it gets really complex here. So what we're facing here is, so we're developing now this project as Square together with Cookie Bank. We face high coordination effort. There are many teams, there are many vendors, as I said. They all have delivery dates, something that they have to rely on. And maybe this business is even constrained by giving estimations about the costs because they have to get funding for this project. And there are many, many things often behind the teams that you really can't see. So Cookie Bank has to know when you're done with your project because they have to start the ad campaign. Marketing has to start the ad campaign. So now what we're facing is like kind of a daily business thing here. In daily business, you might not really have the resources nor the time for this exploratory approaches. And sometimes maybe it's better to even get better at estimation. So using the past for your future approaches can also be an exploratory approach, of course. But what I want to say here is that the more complex things get here, the more unlikely is it that your estimation is correct. But on the other hand, we all have to have something that we really can rely on to really coordinate in these high complexity kind of things here. So, and this is where it really gets foggy between the estimates versus no estimates movement. I promised you some objective evaluation, and they're kind of having the same goal here. So they all just want to reduce waste, yeah? And so on the one hand, what I'm saying is it might be good to have estimates for that coordination, but on the other hand, you can maybe get rid of them. What actually is the goal of estimates and no estimates? We will discuss this in the recap in a minute, but let me give you my real world example for finishing up here. So what is my experience with this whole no estimates? What is the thing that David and me have been talking about this whole hour? So we had this exact situation here, yeah, where we were developing a project for a bank. This was a project of around 1 million euros. Team started with 3 people, ramped up to 7, and we completed it without estimates, almost. But note the highlights here: completed and almost. So, of course, we started with some kinds of estimations. Yeah, we had to communicate them a timeline, a scope range, a fixed price for that in the end. So, note that we kind of kept the timeline flexible, the scope a bit flexible. But in the end, it was a fixed price. What we faced is an extremely complex environment. Yeah. Many dependency, many team constraints. We were not really cross-functional because there were just things that the customer could do. So on a platform level, for example. And still, even with the variables of the timeline range, of the scope range, it ended up in massive stress, frustration, missed deadlines, all these things. But still, as I said before, the project was too important to not do it. We already signed that contract. So there's not an alternative of not doing it anymore just because it's late. Yeah. So what we did actually here was we abandoned Scrum. We said, okay, it just doesn't really work. We started some Scrum Band-like approach. We let our customer prioritize the next important thing, so the next important bug, the next important story. And what we did was we created a high trust environment. We tried to be extremely transparent with everything we're doing in super close collaboration. And what we have become is a really reliable partner, someone you can trust. They knew that we are doing our best, that we cannot move faster. And what happened? Estimations on a story level became completely irrelevant because they saw what we're doing. They saw how fast we're moving. But as I said, we needed some kind of estimations. And these estimations are timelines. Yeah. Timelines, sometimes even costs for on a bigger magnitude, on a higher magnitude, for decision makers around the projects that are actually realistic. So using past for the future predictability. So something we did already and then projected to the future to actually have some kind of realistic timeline. And also the timelines, the estimations for coordinations with vendor, with other parts of the business. Still, after all these changes, it was no smooth sailing. Things went sideways regardlessly, of course. But what we ended up is less stress. We are now a higher performing team, we're a happier team, and we have a happier customer. So all these positive experiences with not having estimates here on a lower level, but not just estimates, but many changes. Yeah. Encouraged us to experiment, and this is what we will do in the future as well. So about the recap. Julian, please tell us, should we estimate now or not? And there's just really one answer that I can give you as a consultant. It depends. Because determining if estimations are useful in a high complexity are a high complexity problem in itself. If we're looking at like the higher magnitude estimations, yeah, we always have to assess the environment we're in. Can we really get rid of estimations? On what level do we need estimations? We really have to question that. And of course, pose the question, are these even wastes or are they fulfilling a good purpose here to estimate? Remember when I told you that if story points are a result of good conversation and they're useful in planning, use them. And what you should do, try out these projections. This is like a really promising approach to really get going, try something out, reduce complexity before you give any projection into the future. Yeah, and about the lower magnitude estimations. Do exactly the same, yeah. Do the exact same thing like you did with the high magnitude estimations. But for low magnitude estimations, it might work better if you have a high trust culture, if you have a high performing team, you have deep understanding of your domain, of your business, of your project, and you have low dependencies. So there's one more thing to say here in the very end of my talk now. As I said, estimate and no estimates kind of have the same goal. They want to reduce waste. Yeah, they kind of want to do the same thing, but somehow they get fed up in kind of some religious discussion about whether to not estimate or to estimate. But the key takeaway here is that you really have to assess whether it makes sense or not. And at some point, there are definitely applications for estimations, and sometimes they're just a waste and you're just using them because you've always done so. And what I want to say is that estimations, yeah, live in businesses. They're inseparably connected in many ways with businesses. And this whole thing, this whole talk is for me just one example for a leverage, yeah, for how you can improve your business, how you can eliminate waste. And this is one example where it's sometimes process over people and following a plan over responding to change. So exactly the opposite of what the Agile Manifesto almost 20 years ago told us. So what I did in this talk is I touched many things with the potential to really rewild Agile, to come back to the original idea of agility, to really think about your value creation. And this is what I really encourage here, to find these spots, to tackle these spots, and to collectively bring Agile back to what it was born from, like the ability to rapidly create and respond to change. That's about it from my talk. Thank you for listening. But before you go, there's one more thing here. My lovely colleague Paul, on the 11th of November, we'll talk about distributed systems and why there's no need that they are complicated. This is going to be a real tech talk again. My talk was more from an agile perspective, from a management perspective. But tune in again for this talk. And another thing, we have a cool opportunity already tomorrow. There's the Socrates Day. And the Socrates Day is not a conference. It's an event for the local software community here in Vienna. It doesn't have a program. And the cool thing here is that you can just come to this day and suggest your topics. You can participate with your topics. And it's all about crafting exceptional software and networking. Okay, so thank you. Now is Q&A time, and I'm sure Paul has already prepared some questions.
Yeah, Julian, thank you very much for your awesome talk. I really loved how you bound back all your experiences to the real beginnings of Agile and what Agile is really about. So thank you very much for that. Really appreciate it. In the YouTube chat, I do not see any question.
Oh, that's great. So my talk was already answered all the questions.
Exactly. But here's exactly one question from David. He's talking about utilizing the Kinefin framework for the explanation of the usefulness of estimates transformed the complex topic into a less complicated one, at least for me. Well done, Julian. Yes, I
Thank
can
you. Great.
totally relate to it. And
Yeah.
I really loved also what David said. So you talked about this Kinefin idea of these four domains: the clear, the complicated, the complex, and the chaotic one. And that it's really worth thinking about where are you within your project, within your
Exactly.
system. So I think that's really a very good thing to do. So
Yeah.
thank you
Yeah.
very much for that.
Yeah, I totally love this framework as well, because it gives you really also tangible approaches on how to deal with this complexity at hand, that you sometimes can follow a plan and there's nothing bad about it, and that you sometimes just have to trust your gut feeling on the other hand, and maybe even emerge practices or already have good practices for problems here. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So another question now recently came up from Lawrence. If you could speak from your own experience, can you remember any time when your team didn't estimate first, but had to adopt estimating later, or it turned out more helpful to do so?
I haven't had the experience that we didn't estimate, but had to come up with estimates on a lower level later. But as I said, it really, really, really depends on the context and on your team. So maybe if we would have been now at the customer, a really cross-functional team, we can create any value in that project that we have to create, and we're not constrained externally. Yeah? And it's all about predictability in the future. And we use story points to really, as a result, as I said, of some good conversations, and we can use them for planning. and planning would be a really important goal for either us or for the customer, then of course estimations here would be a good thing, definitely. So this is just one example that would come into my mind here, but we can discuss this endlessly, I promise.
Absolutely. I guess that's a discussion every one of us has
Yeah,
from
yeah.
time to time. Yes,
I hope this
absolutely.
answers your question, Lawrence.
Okay, I guess it was a very insightful answer. Thank you. There's another one from Stefan, and it's I think an interesting one. It's, so to say, real talk. So how do you proceed in convincing the typical customers with the traditional waterfall thinking to not do estimates? Could you explain your argumentation strategies a little bit more?
Okay,
A
so
tough one.
yeah, that's a tough one. That's a really tough one. So we have customers that do implementation in a waterfall kind of thing, but on the other hand, we don't really want to estimate. And this is the thing, going back to my example with a cookie bank, um, where there's really not much you can do when you're starting your project. I mean, if you are competing with many other vendors to develop this software project, and they require you to give them some kind of estimation, then there's not really anything around that or what leverage you can take. I think the only thing here is if you already developed anything for that customer, yeah, and there's already some trust between you and the customer. So you work together, you were good business partners before. Then maybe you can convince your customer to start with, as I said, that high value part of something and show them that you really can swiftly create value and can do it your way if they trust you that you are doing it correctly. Yeah. And then use that projection method that I told you before. That might be a very good strategy to address this. But as I said, there are so many variables in this question that we had to discuss to really come up with a good answer here. But that would be one thing, how I would go forward with it.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you also in your talk stressed already the point very much that trust is one of
Yeah,
the,
yeah,
the boundaries around the
exactly.
customer and us
Yeah, yeah,
as a consultancy. And if the trust is already there, then it's really a way better ground. And that's the first thing usually with some high value impact to really start giving the customer value pretty quick to know each other and to learn to know how we work and how we can
exactly.
contribute to the customer's value. And
Yeah,
I think that's a very
exactly.
challenging part. And then if you have built up the trust, it's way easier to really take the customer with you on this ride to using no
Exactly,
estimates.
exactly. To maybe even abandoning that waterfall approach, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because they know they can trust you and they have seen what you can do in maybe previous projects and maybe
Yeah.
other proof of proficiencies that you can give them. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for your
Absolutely.
addition, Paul. Yeah, good
Yeah.
point.
David, another David even asked a new question where he says, at one point you said the team got more productive after you went with Scrumban and more stuff. How did you measure that if you don't have estimations, or was it gut feeling?
That's a very, very good question. Yeah. Actually, to be honest, it was gut feeling. It was complete gut feeling because, as I said, not doing the project was not an option. There was already that contract. That project is extremely high value for that customer. So there is just no need to really track the performance here because they saw that we're actually doing our best. But what I found out is that we went from being slow because we were so constrained and we were so much focusing on estimations, on other things, on yeah, all these things around that I really felt that after really having measured that, I also talked with the team that we felt way more productive and that we went way faster with our project in implementation. But of course, this was also just a thing here in that very specific context, of course. And it worked for us here. And you're right, I don't have proof for that, but it really feels like much moved before. But there was also, as I said, not really a point in really measuring this, because why should I measure it? Instead, I could just go on and create the value for the customer.
Absolutely. And I remember from what you explained in the talk, you went through a phase of pain. I guess pain for the team, pain for you, and also a little bit pain for the customer in that phase, I think. And after the transition you did, your story immediately totally felt way easier, also beneficial for the customer. So I think maybe if you don't have even numbers, so having the collaborative feeling that you now are really in a partnership and not so much in a way the supplier relationship really can be a good sign for that benefit.
Yeah.
Okay. There's one guy I think we know from other talks. That's our famous X3Y. And he or she is asking, so how did you build that trust? You were still living agile values like showing working code ASAP, others?
So how did we build that trust? So beforehand in our contract, we had like agreements, okay, you can develop in your chamber, but you have to deliver that new package on deadline XY to our test environment. And what you're doing in between, it doesn't really matter. So how are we really creating trust here? Of course, we had touch points in clarifying requirements, but we didn't really have touch points in development. And in the end, we just put that thing on a test environment. Yeah. And of course, this is not a real process that creates trust, because the customer doesn't really know what you're actually doing, how you're creating things, and that you're actually giving your best here. And with really opening up, so with having the whole team in planning sessions, where we're structuring the backlog, where we're prioritizing the backlog, having the team with explaining the customer what the problem actually is and why we cannot move faster, and really being there for the customer, solving their problems together with the customer, working collaboratively on the problems. That really gave that trust, that real transparency, so that they could really see what we're doing and how are we adding value to their process, to their project. And this is the whole thing, how we created that high trust environment here.
Okay, thank you very much. So looking into the chat, I do not see any new questions. So, and we are already approaching our end time. So I think it was a good chat. Thank you very much for your very insightful talk, Julian.
Thank you.
And the answers to the question. Thank you for the audience for watching and for giving the questions. And yes, I want to stress we have one Brainfood Talk each month. So please stay tuned. And yes, I have to say at the end, I really liked your image of the stakeholder you showed somewhere in between. I really appreciate it.
The stakeholder.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
okay.
Thank you much, Julian, and have a nice weekend.
Yeah.
See ya.
Thank you. You too. Thanks for listening, guys. Bye-bye.
See ya.